The $12 million engine screamed once, rattled deep in its throat like something dying, and went silent. Not a gradual wind-down. Not a warning. Just a scream, and then nothing, the kind of nothing that costs people their careers. 3 of the most decorated engineering teams in international motorsport had spent the last 18 hours taking that car apart and putting it back together. Arguing over data printouts, rerunning simulations, flying in specialists from 3 different continents. The clock above the garage door showed 1 hour and 53 minutes before the most important qualifying race of the season. Outside, a city of cameras and contracts and shareholder expectations waited for a miracle. Inside, the air smelled like burnt wiring and failure, and in the far corner of that garage, moving so quietly that no one had noticed him in hours, an old man in gray coveralls pushed a mop across the polished concrete floor, paused near the rear axle of the silent car, and tilted his head slightly to one side. He stood there for exactly 12 seconds. Then he said, in a voice that carried just far enough to be heard over the arguing, "You've been fixing the wrong thing." The garage went quiet, in a different way than the engine had. This was the quiet of 47 people turning to look at a janitor. Then someone laughed. Then everyone laughed. 37 minutes later, that engine came back to life, and the laughter stopped for good. The city of Las Vegas does not do subtlety. It does spectacle. It does scale. And when the International Apex Racing Circuit chose the Nevada desert as the site of its 30th anniversary championship event, the result was a facility that looked less like a racetrack and more like a cathedral built for speed. The infield paddock alone stretched longer than 2 city blocks, lined with team hospitality suites whose glass walls and climate-controlled interiors belonged in architectural magazines rather than motorsport. Above the main straight, a scoreboard the size of a football field displayed real-time telemetry data in numbers large enough to read from the upper grandstands, where 40,000 ticket holders would fill their seats in less than 2 days. Overhead lighting rigs turned the entire complex into a permanent noon, and the air hummed with the sound of generators, fuel systems, and the low-frequency noise of 17 different teams running calibration tests on their machines. It was the most watched, most sponsored, most analyzed racing event on the planet, and for the last 4 years running, one team had stood above all of them. Titan Apex Racing had not simply won the Constructors' Championship. They had redefined what winning looked like in the modern era. Their cars ran on proprietary fuel injection architecture developed in-house, managed by an AI-assisted performance system that had more computing power than most university research departments. Their drivers were celebrities. Their logo appeared on the sides of aircraft, on the wrists of billionaires, on the jerseys of teenagers who had never been within 500 miles of a racetrack. And their CEO, a woman named Victoria Marsh, had been named to the covers of 3 separate business publications in the same calendar year. Victoria was 38 years old, which made her the youngest chief executive in the history of major international motorsport, a fact that journalists loved and competitors feared. She had inherited the team from her father at 31, after his illness, and what she had inherited was a mid-table operation running on legacy systems and borrowed confidence. What she had built in 7 years was something entirely different. She was precise the way surgical instruments are precise. She was demanding the way physics is demanding, not cruel, not arbitrary, but absolutely uninterested in excuses. She had memorized the technical specifications of every component on her car, the way other people memorized song lyrics, and she expected everyone in her organization to meet a standard that she had defined and would enforce without apology. Her lead driver, Marcus Hale, was 26 years old and had been on the covers of the same magazines Victoria had, but for different reasons. He was fast, he was photogenic, and he had the specific quality that made broadcasters love him. He made complicated things look effortless. In press conferences, he smiled easily and spoke in the kind of sound bites that clip well for 30-second segments. In the car, he was something else entirely focused and precise, and capable of threading a machine through gaps that his competitors refused to even attempt. The combination of Victoria's engineering obsession and Marcus's ability to translate it into lap times had produced a team that seemed, entering this weekend essentially unbeatable. Seemed, the evening before qualifying, while the rest of the paddock settled into pre-race routines, a man named Walter Hayes pushed a wheeled mop bucket along the service corridor that ran behind the Titan Apex garage, moving with the unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere particular to be and no particular reason to hurry. He was somewhere past 60, with the kind of face that had stored up a great deal of weather over the years, deep lines, calm eyes, and a stillness about him that was either profound peace or profound sadness, and was probably both. He wore gray coveralls with the venue logo on the chest pocket. His name was stitched above the logo in the faded thread of many washings. As he passed the open side door of the Titan Apex garage, he slowed, almost imperceptibly, and glanced at the car positioned in the center of the space under the overhead lights. He moved on. Nobody noticed. The disaster did not announce itself gradually. It arrived all at once, the way real disasters always do, in the final 15 minutes of the pre-qualifying shakedown run. Marcus had the car out on the track for what was supposed to be a routine fuel load calibration pass, nothing aggressive, nothing that would put stress on any system not already proven reliable. He was holding a comfortable pace through the second sector when the car simply lost power. Not a reduction. Not a hesitation. A full drop. As if someone had reached into the engine bay and pulled out a fistful of essential components. The steering went heavy. The rear end swung. Marcus had the reflexes of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of emergency. And he brought the car to the inside barrier with enough control that the damage was limited to pride and schedule, not to the machine or himself. But the look on his face as he climbed from the cockpit told every camera and every engineer watching exactly how serious this was. Victoria was in the garage within 90 seconds. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The engineers who had been standing around the telemetry monitors, when the data flatlined, all felt the temperature in the room change when she walked in, and it had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She looked at the screens. She looked at the car being trailered back from the circuit. She looked at her chief engineer, a heavyset man named Gerald Forsyth, who had been building racing cars for 22 years. And she said, with the precise calm of someone who has decided that calm is the most terrifying option available, "Tell me exactly what happened, and tell me exactly when it will be fixed." Gerald told her what the data showed. He told her what the data did not show. He told her that his team would have the answer within an hour. He was wrong about the hour. He was wrong about the answer. He was wrong in ways that would not become clear for another 18 hours. And wrong in ways that would not become clear until a janitor said 12 words in a half-empty garage at 2 in the morning. The first engineering team to work the problem was Gerald's own crew, the primary technical staff of Titan Apex. The people who had built this car and knew its systems at the cellular level. They pulled the fuel system completely. They mapped every injector, tested every pressure line, replaced 3 components that showed marginal wear even though the data suggested they were not the problem. Because at this stage, no one was certain what the data was actually saying. 3 hours in, they had found nothing conclusive. The simulation model showed a healthy system. The car sat silent and did not offer any explanation. The second team arrived at 11 at night. They were electronics and AI specialists from a firm that Titan Apex contracted for software diagnostics. 4 engineers with laptops containing more analytical power than most countries' space programs, who ran a complete simulation of every electronic interaction in the car's control architecture and found, according to their instruments and their models, absolutely nothing wrong. The car was, in every measurable sense, fine. It simply refused to run. The third team landed at Las Vegas International Airport just after midnight. 2 senior engineers flown in from the German manufacturer that produced the car's central control module, who had been contacted by Victoria personally and who had rerouted their schedules at significant expense and disruption to be standing in the Titan Apex garage with their proprietary diagnostic equipment by 1:30 in the morning. They replaced the central control module entirely. They installed a unit that had been validated on another car less than 2 weeks earlier. The engine turned over, ran for 11 seconds, and died. The German engineers looked at each other, with the particular expression of people confronting something that does not fit into any category they have been trained to handle. At 2 in the morning, the arguing started. It was not the loud arguing of people who have given up. It was the focused, technical arguing of people who are genuinely frightened and are processing that fear through the only language they trust, which is data. Teams 1 and 2 blamed a software interaction that Team 3's module replacement should have cleared. Team 3 insisted the problem was mechanical, pre-existing, invisible, in standard diagnostics. Gerald stood in the middle of the garage floor with his arms crossed and his jaw set and stared at the car as though he could intimidate it into revealing its secrets. Victoria stood against the far wall and said nothing for a long time. She had her phone in her hand, and she was aware, with the specific awareness of someone who has spent years managing institutional pressure, that there were 6 messages from the board of directors that she had not answered, and that the overnight futures on Titan Apex's parent company's stock had dropped 2.5% on rumors that the car would not make the grid. The gap between what was riding on this moment and what anyone in this room was currently able to do about it had become physically uncomfortable. She was aware of all of this. She kept her face calm. She looked at the car. She did not look at the corner of the garage where, 40 feet away, Walter Hayes was moving slowly between the support pillars with his mop, cleaning up the coffee spills and dropped food wrappers that accumulated whenever engineers worked through the night. He had been there for the last hour. No one had noticed. Walter Hayes had a way of moving through spaces that made him essentially invisible to people who were not looking for him. This was not a skill he had cultivated deliberately. It was simply the natural result of being, for many years, someone who existed on the edges of rooms that belonged to other people. He had learned to take up very little space. He had learned to be quiet. He had learned that if you moved with purpose and kept your eyes on the floor in front of you, the people arguing about critical pressure ratios and electronic interference patterns would look straight through you the same way they looked straight through the chairs and tool carts and everything else that was not immediately relevant to their emergency. Walter had not always been invisible. There had been a time when he walked into rooms, and the rooms reorganized themselves around the fact of his presence, when people with more seniority and more credentials stopped mid-sentence and listened because they had learned that whatever he was about to say was worth the interruption. That time had been a long time ago. He had made his peace with its absence, or something close to peace, which is the best that most people manage, but Walter's eyes were not entirely on the floor tonight. They had not been on the floor for the last hour. Every time his route brought him within 40 feet of the car, something happened in his peripheral vision that he could not quite make himself ignore. There was a sound, or rather, there was the absence of a sound, a specific absence in the way the car sat that was different from how a car ought to sit when it was simply broken. He noticed the way the German engineers had reinstalled the control module, and something in the back of his mind that had not been activated in a very long time made a sound like a door opening. He noticed which section of the fuel rail Gerald's team had tested 3 times, and which section they had passed over on the assumption that the data was reliable. He noticed what the data could not tell them, because he had spent a long time, in another life, understanding exactly what data could and could not see. A young engineer named Patrick, who had been awake for 16 hours and was running on his 4th cup of coffee and whatever chemical compound the human body produces in response to crisis, looked up from his screen and saw the janitor standing a few feet away from the rear quarter of the car. "Hey," Patrick said, with the entitled impatience of someone who was 26 and had 2 engineering degrees and was absolutely certain about the hierarchy of this situation. "You can't be near the car. Stay back." Walter nodded politely and moved back. Patrick returned to his screen. Walter kept moving with his mop, but he had seen what he needed to see. In the tool room off the main corridor, on the 3rd shelf of a gray metal locker assigned to maintenance staff, sat a toolbox. It was old, the kind of old that is not dusty, because it has been regularly cleaned and maintained, but carries age in the way the metal has worn to a specific patina, in the way the latches operate, with the smooth certainty of a mechanism that has been opened and closed thousands of times. On the lid, barely visible under layers of careful polishing that had thinned the paint without erasing it entirely, was a logo. It was not the venue's logo. It was the logo of a racing team, a stylized apex mark in red and gold that had not appeared on a competitive vehicle in close to 30 years. The logo of a team that had, in its era, won 4 consecutive world championships using an engine architecture that their chief engineer had designed essentially alone, in a period when the computational tools now considered basic did not yet exist, and intuition and understanding, and the willingness to lie on a cold garage floor and listen to what a machine was telling you were still considered legitimate engineering methodologies. Walter had carried that toolbox with him for a long time. He had not opened it in 7 years. He kept it because he could not bring himself to get rid of it, the same way he kept his old technical journals and his original hand-drawn schematics and the photograph of his wife that sat on the windowsill of his apartment 4 miles from this racetrack, in a building he could afford on a maintenance worker's salary, in a city that had very little interest in what he had once been. At 2:47 in the morning, Walter Hayes walked into the Titan Apex garage carrying his toolbox. He set it on the concrete floor without a sound. He waited for a moment when the arguing had reached a natural pause, one of those silences that fall in the middle of a protracted technical disagreement when everyone has run out of new things to say and is simply repeating older things with more emphasis, and then he said, in a voice calibrated to reach the people nearest the car without quite reaching the others, "You're fixing the symptom, not the cause." There was a beat. Then Gerald Forsyth, who had not slept in 20 hours and was operating on a cocktail of adrenaline and wounded professional pride, turned around and looked at the old man in the gray coveralls standing next to a metal toolbox and said, with more exhaustion than cruelty, "Excuse me?" Walter said it again, slightly louder. "You're chasing what the sensors are showing you. But the sensors are being deceived. You're not going to find this in the data." Patrick said something under his breath that was not kind. One of the German engineers exchanged a glance with his colleague that communicated, wordlessly, that they had been flown across an ocean at great expense and were not accustomed to being second-guessed by facilities staff. Victoria Marsh pushed off from the wall where she had been standing and crossed the garage floor in 12 steps, and the room rearranged itself around her movement the way rooms always did. She looked at Walter. She looked at his toolbox. She looked at the logo on the lid for half a second, longer than she looked at anything else. And something shifted very slightly in her expression, not recognition exactly, but the stirring of a memory she could not quite place. She had 43 minutes before a window of pre-dawn quiet that her logistics team had identified as the last viable opportunity to run a diagnostic circuit before the race. She had no functioning car. She had 3 expert teams who had spent the collective equivalent of a small country's annual engineering budget and produced nothing useful. She had a janitor standing in her garage at 3 in the morning claiming to know something her specialists did not. Victoria Marsh had not built one of the most successful racing operations in the world by being afraid of information from unexpected sources. She said, "What do you need?" Walter said 3 things. He needed silence, complete silence. No voices, no keyboard input, no active simulation running on any monitor in the garage. He needed the overhead systems powered down to standby, which would take the ambient electromagnetic noise in the room from a level that disrupted certain older diagnostic techniques to a level that did not. And he needed a flashlight, not a modern LED unit, but the old incandescent mechanic's light, hanging on the hook by the side door, that had been there since the facility was built, and that no one ever used because it was a relic. The German engineers stared. Patrick opened his mouth. Gerald looked at Victoria, and Victoria gave a single nod that communicated everything that needed to be communicated. And the room went quiet. Walter crouched beside the car. He did not open his toolbox immediately. He put one palm flat against the chassis near the rear suspension mounting and held it there for several seconds, eyes closed, feeling something that instruments were not measuring. He moved to the fuel rail and crouched lower, tilting the incandescent light until its beam caught the underside of the secondary injector housing at an angle that the overhead lighting did not provide. He leaned in close and breathed slowly through his nose, and something in his expression changed. He moved to the right rear corner of the car, the area that everyone's attention had orbited around without quite landing on, because the sensors in that region had returned normal readings and normal readings meant there was nothing to find. He lay down on the concrete floor, face up, and slid under the rear end of the car, with the mechanical ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times, in a body that was younger, and in a body that was older, and had never stopped finding it natural. He was under the car for 4 minutes. When he slid back out, he sat up, reached for his toolbox, and opened it. The interior was organized with the precision of a surgeon's kit. Every tool had its place. Every place was occupied. The tools were old, some of them genuinely antique by the standards of a modern engineering facility, but their edges were sharp and their surfaces were clean, and the people who were watching, even the ones who had been dismissive 30 seconds ago, found themselves looking at that open toolbox with an expression they could not quite name. Walter said nothing for 20 minutes. He worked with the lights off, except for his incandescent flashlight and a small magnetic LED. He clipped to the chassis to illuminate a specific section of the fuel pressure regulation assembly. A section that 3 teams had examined and passed over because the diagnostic readings were clean. He was not looking at what the readings showed. He was looking at what they could not show, which was this: a micro vibration generated by the specific resonance frequency of the rear suspension under high-speed load conditions that had over time introduced a cumulative angular displacement of less than a millimeter into the mounting position of the primary fuel pressure sensor. Less than a millimeter. Invisible to static testing. Invisible to simulation. Invisible to every diagnostic protocol designed to test components at rest. But at race speed, under full thermal load, when the engine was running at the temperature that the pre-qualifying run had achieved in the moment before the power dropped, that fractional misalignment crossed a threshold. The sensor read a pressure that was not the actual pressure. The AI management system responded to the false reading by shutting down fuel delivery to protect the engine from what it calculated was a dangerous overpressure condition. The engine stopped. Not because it was broken, because it had been told, very convincingly, that it was about to be. The computer was not wrong. The data was not wrong. The sensor was telling the truth about what it was measuring. What it was measuring was simply not what it was supposed to be measuring anymore. Machines don't lie. Walter had told a room full of engineers once, in a different building, in a different decade. The people who operate them do the lying. They lie to themselves about what the numbers mean. They trust the readout and stop trusting the object in front of them. He had not said that tonight. He had not said much of anything tonight. He let his hands say it. The clock on the wall showed 31 minutes elapsed when Walter sat up from under the car and reached for a length of custom-fabricated vibration damping cable from the bottom section of his toolbox, a piece he had made, himself, years ago, from materials that were not available in any current supply catalog, because the technique for making them had gone out of fashion when the industry decided that sensors were more reliable than craftsmanship. He secured the sensor mounting with 2 components, a machined collar that corrected the angular displacement, and a damping insert that would absorb the resonance frequency before it could reintroduce the problem at higher speeds. He recalibrated the fuel pressure at the injector rail by hand, using a mechanical gauge from his toolbox that predated digital calibration tools, because it measured actual system pressure without the interpretive layer that electronic systems added between the reading and the reality. He tightened 3 fasteners to torque specifications that he calculated from memory because he had written those specifications himself in a different context before some of the people standing around him had been born. 36 minutes. He stood, closed his toolbox, picked up the incandescent light, and said to Victoria, "Start it." The garage had the quality of a room that has stopped breathing. Gerald's hand moved to the ignition activation panel. He looked at Victoria. She nodded once. The starter motor turned. The engine caught, faltered in the first 2 seconds exactly as it had been faltering for 18 hours, and Walter said, without raising his voice, "Hold." He walked back to the rear of the car. He crouched. He made one final adjustment. A single quarter turn of a setting that he had deliberately left fractionally loose to confirm his diagnosis in live running conditions, and which was now telling him what he needed to know. He stood. He said, Again, Gerald activated the ignition. The engine turned over. The engine caught. The engine did not falter. It settled into its idle with the deep, smooth, authoritative voice of a $12 million machine, running exactly as it was designed to run, and it held there, and it did not waver, and the sound it made was so clean and so correct that several engineers who had been listening to it misbehave for a day and a half felt something loosen in their chests that they had not been aware was tight. The sound filled the garage and went out into the Las Vegas night. Somewhere outside, a television crew that had been positioned near the Titan Apex paddock in anticipation of a withdrawal announcement turned their cameras toward the garage as if they could hear, from 50 meters away, that something had changed. The clock showed 37 minutes from the moment Walter had crouched beside the car for the first time. Victoria stood very still for a long moment. Then she walked to where Walter was standing and looked at him with the full attention she gave to things she was genuinely trying to understand, which was the most intense attention that most people ever experienced directed at them. She said, "Who are you?" It was not a rude question. It was the question of someone who has just discovered that the landscape of the situation she thought she understood has a feature on it that her map did not show. Walter picked up his toolbox. He looked at her with the calm of someone who has had a long time to make peace with a complicated answer to that question. He said his name. She said she knew his name. She had read it off his coverall. She meant, who was he before this, and how did he know what he knew, and why was he here pushing a mop in a maintenance coverall, instead of standing in a position that matched whatever it was he had just demonstrated he possessed? Walter looked at the car idling in the center of the garage, and something moved through his expression, not grief exactly, not pride exactly, but a compound of both that had settled into something quieter over the years. He said, "I used to do this for a living." It was such a profound understatement that it took some time for the people in the room to understand how profound it was. His full name was Walter Raymond Hayes. If you had access to the historical records of professional motorsport from the period between 25 and 35 years before this night, the technical documentation, the design filings, the internal engineering reports of a now-defunct racing operation called Meridian Dynamics, you would find his name attached to the foundational architecture of the fuel management system that had evolved, through several generations of refinement and corporate acquisition, into the proprietary system that currently sat in the Titan Apex car. He had not designed one component. He had designed the philosophy, the core logic by which the system decided what information to trust and what interventions to make, what to do when the data and the reality of the machine diverged. He had built it not from software templates but from a decade of direct mechanical experience, from thousands of hours spent listening to engines behave in ways that could not be fully captured in any specification document, from the conviction that a system which understood only what its sensors reported was a system that understood only the edge of the truth. He had been 29 years old when he first put those principles on paper, in a set of notebooks that he still owned. Stored in a box in his apartment, which he had not opened in several years but could not bring himself to throw away. He had spent the next 8 years testing those principles against reality, in conditions that the industry at the time considered inadequately supported, inadequately funded, and after the first 2 championships impossibly well rewarded, Meridian Dynamics won 4 championships on Walter's engineering. They won them the way teams win when they have figured out something the competition has not yet understood, and the something they had figured out was Walter Hayes. Then the company was acquired. A new technical director arrived with his own ideas about credit and attribution and the political geography of intellectual property. Walter had found himself in a negotiation about his own work, about who had really developed the principles he had written down in notebooks he still owned, who deserved the patents, who would have their name on the next generation of the technology. He was not good at that kind of negotiation. He had never needed to be. He lost. Not dramatically. There was no public confrontation, no court case, no industry scandal. He simply found that the new structure of the company did not have a role for him that matched what he had been. He left. He did not go to a competitor. He left the industry entirely. His wife, a woman named Margaret, had been ill for 2 years by then, and leaving gave him time to be with her in the way that his previous life had not allowed. She died 14 months after he resigned. He sold the house they had shared and moved into an apartment, and spent a year being very quiet. Then he got the maintenance job at the racing facility, because it was near a racetrack, and he found that he could not live entirely without the sound of engines, even from a distance, even through the walls. He had been there for 7 years. He knew every centimeter of every garage in the facility. He had watched dozens of teams work on dozens of cars, and he had not once offered an opinion that anyone had asked for, because he had understood, clearly and without bitterness, that his opinion was not something this world currently valued. Tonight had been different. Tonight, he had watched 3 teams work for 18 hours on a problem that he had identified in 12 seconds, and something in him that had been very patient for a very long time had reached the end of its patience. Gerald Forsyth pulled the telemetry data from the repaired car while it idled, and the data showed a system operating within nominal parameters in every register. Not just repaired, improved. The fuel pressure was more stable than any logged baseline from the previous 6 months of testing. Gerald stared at the numbers for a long time without speaking. One of the German engineers walked slowly to the rear of the car and crouched to examine the repair, and the look on his face was the look of a craftsman examining work done by another craftsman, a recognition that transcended the gulf of years and methodology. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, quietly, "To no one in particular, this is not standard material." He was looking at the damping insert. "Where did you get this?" Walter told him he had made it. The German engineer looked at him with an expression that had passed completely beyond the territory of condescension and arrived somewhere entirely different. Several of the younger engineers in the room had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being simultaneously competent and completely inadequate in a way that they had not anticipated when they began their careers. Marcus Hale arrived at the garage at 6 in the morning, 4 hours before race start, and was told by his race engineer that the car had been fixed. He asked how. His race engineer paused and said, "The night maintenance man figured it out." Marcus looked at the engineer for a moment, and then looked at the car, and then said, "Is he still here?" He was not. Walter had left at 3:40 in the morning, after declining Victoria's offer to arrange a hotel room, after politely refusing the 2 attempts by younger engineers to get him to explain his repair methodology in detail, and after accepting, without ceremony, a handshake from Gerald Forsyth that lasted a few seconds longer than handshakes usually do between people who have just acknowledged a debt they cannot quite express. He had walked out of the garage with his toolbox, turned left down the service corridor, and was gone. The race itself was 41 laps around a circuit that wound through the Las Vegas desert in a series of high-speed sweepers and technical infield sections that demanded something specific from every car that attempted them: trust. Trust between driver and machine. Trust between telemetry and reality. Trust that the thing beneath you would continue doing what it was built to do when you asked the most of it at the worst possible moment. Titan Apex had qualified 3rd overnight, a position that reflected the scale of their disruption and the speed with which they had overcome it, and one that placed Marcus in a part of the grid that required him to be patient in a way that did not come entirely naturally to him. The field went into the first corner as a compressed mass of competing intentions, and Marcus held his line, kept his elbows in, and gave the car time to tell him who it had become. In the opening 10 laps, Marcus ran conservative, managing tire temperatures and gathering information about how the repaired systems were behaving under race load. The car spoke to him through the wheel and the seat and the pedals, the way cars always speak to the people who know how to listen, and what it was saying was cleaner than he had expected. The fuel pressure was not just stable, it was notably more stable than in any of the previous race weekends this season. The engine was pulling cleanly through the higher RPM ranges, in a way that his data engineer would later identify as the absence of a micro-hesitation that had been present in log data for so long that no one had flagged it as anomalous, because it had always been there. Something in the rear quarter of the car was more composed, more settled, more certain of itself. He began pushing in lap 14. By lap 22 he was second. The crowd in the grandstands had been told, by the broadcast and by the paddock rumor circuit that runs faster than any official communication, that this car had been on the verge of withdrawal 12 hours ago. They were watching it with the particular attention of people who are witnessing something that does not quite fit into the category of things that are supposed to happen. By lap 31, with 10 laps remaining, and the race leader managing a tire degradation problem that his car's setup had not anticipated, Marcus drove to the inside of the final corner of the back, straight in a move that the broadcast commentators described as audacious, and that Marcus's data engineer, watching the telemetry in real time, described with an expression that required no words. By the time they reached the start-finish straight for the 32nd time, Titan Apex was leading. The commentator said something that became a clip that traveled further and faster than most things said at racetracks. That car drove out of this garage 12 hours from disaster, and it is now leading the most watched race of the season. Whatever they did to that machine last night, it worked. They held the lead to the end. Gerald Forsyth stood on the pit wall, with his headset pushed back on his head, and said nothing for a long time after the checkered flag fell, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The broadcast feed showed the team's garage erupting, showed Victoria Marsh standing on the pit wall with her arms above her head in the unself-conscious way of someone who has stopped performing for cameras and is simply feeling something real, showed Marcus doing a victory lap with the checkered flag streaming behind the car, trailing in the dry desert air like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had taken a very long time to write. In the corner of one wide-angle shot, if you looked carefully at the background and knew where to look, you could see the service corridor door. It was closed. The corridor behind it was empty. The celebration in the paddock lasted hours. Sponsor representatives materialized from wherever sponsor representatives wait: hospitality suites, satellite uplinks, the glass-walled lounges, where the money behind the spectacle makes the calculations it is always making. Journalists filed in with their cameras and their questions. The story they wrote was about the technology and the team and Marcus Hale's precision driving and Victoria Marsh's composure under pressure, which was a true story, as far as it went. Victoria gave 2 press conferences and answered questions about the team's performance and their championship prospects. She thanked the engineering staff. She said all the right things with the fluency of someone who had said right things under pressure many times and understood the social function of the exercise. The cameras left satisfied. Patrick, the young engineer who had told Walter to step back from the car, spent an hour in the post-race celebration with the distinct sensation of someone who has said something they wish they could unsay, and did not enjoy the champagne in the way he had imagined enjoying it. But twice during the celebration, and then several more times as the noise wound down toward the quieter hours of the Vegas night, Victoria found herself standing still in the middle of the noise, looking toward the service corridor door, thinking about a man who had looked at a broken car for 12 seconds and known something that 18 hours of combined expert analysis had not found. She sent someone to find Walter's personnel file. She sat in her office after midnight, with the file open on her desk, and read it slowly. And as she read it, the pieces assembled into a picture that she had not expected, and that, once assembled, she could not stop looking at. She found the name of the company he had worked for. She found the dates. She cross-referenced them with the technical lineage documentation for the engine system her own car ran on, a document she had read once, at a detailed level, and had not returned to, because it was history, and history was the past, and her professional orientation was toward the future. The name Walter Hayes appeared in the foundational design credits of a fuel management philosophy that had directly influenced 3 subsequent generations of the technology in her garage. And she found, in the acquisition documentation for Meridian Dynamics, a section that described the reassignment of intellectual property in terms that were accurate in a legal sense and profoundly unjust in a human sense. And she found the name of the executive who had managed that reassignment. And the name was familiar to her because it was the same name she had grown up calling her father. She sat with that for a long time. Her father had been a complicated man. He had built things. He had also broken things. He had been generous in some directions and not in others, and she had understood this about him in the abstract way that children understand their parents' flaws when they are old enough to understand them and young enough to still grant them the absolution of context. This was not abstract. This was specific. A man who had built the foundation of the thing she had built her career on top of had been removed from his own work by a decision her father had been part of, had spent decades in obscurity, had come back close enough to the thing he loved to hear its sound through a wall, and had saved her season with tools he had carried for 30 years in a locker. She went looking for him the next morning. His locker in the maintenance room was empty. Not recently emptied. The latch was dry. The interior had the settled quality of something that had not been opened in hours. On the shelf inside, he had left two things. One was his toolbox. One was a folded piece of paper, old, the kind of paper that comes from an engineering notebook, covered in hand-drawn schematics in pencil, so precise they could have been printed. At the top of the page, in handwriting that had the quality of someone who had once been trained to draw technical documentation by hand, were the words that described the core logic of a fuel management philosophy. At the bottom, in a different hand, more personal, less precise, written in the pen of someone who is not drawing a schematic but simply writing a thought, were 11 words. Don't let the machines make you forget how to listen. Victoria had the toolbox cleaned and mounted in a case with a glass front. She had the schematic framed by a specialist who handled archival documents and understood how to preserve old paper without erasing the character of its age. She found a location for them, which was a room in the Titan Apex technical facility that the team used for engineering development and training, a room that had previously been called the Advanced Systems Lab, and that she renamed, 3 weeks after the race, the Walter Hayes Innovation Lab. She consulted no one before making the decision. The naming ceremony was small, her choice, not for any practical reason, but because the things being honored were not small and she did not want them trivialized by scale. She had the framed schematic hung on the wall, and beside it, in a separate mount, the old incandescent flashlight from the garage hook that Walter had used during his 37 minutes, a relic, a tool, a kind of evidence. Below both of them, a printed card with 11 words. The young engineers who worked in that room were told the story of that night as part of their orientation. They were told it not as a feel-good anecdote, but as a technical lesson, a philosophical lesson, a lesson about the difference between what instruments measure and what is actually true, about the kind of knowledge that accumulates in people who have spent decades paying attention to real objects in the physical world rather than to the models of those objects that computers construct. They were taught to trust their diagnostics and to understand where diagnostics end. Some of them understood quickly, some took longer. All of them, eventually, kept the story. A month after the race, a postcard arrived at the Titan Apex Racing offices, addressed to Victoria Marsh, with no return address. The postmark was from a town in the Nevada high desert, 300 miles northeast of Las Vegas, in a direction where the desert goes on long enough to make the distance feel like intention. The handwriting on the back was the same as the handwriting at the bottom of the schematic: personal, economical. Written by someone with nothing to prove and nothing to rush. One sentence: the car didn't need a miracle that night. It only needed someone willing to listen. Victoria kept the postcard on her desk. She thought about what it cost a person to stay near the thing they loved for years without being invited back inside it, and what it preserved in them to do so. She thought about patience as a form of expertise that no certification could confer. On a road somewhere in the Nevada desert, in the early morning light of a day with no agenda and no destination that required arriving on time, Walter Hayes drove a truck that was older than most of the engineers who now worked in the room that bore his name. The cab smelled of coffee and old leather and the particular dry warmth of desert morning coming through a cracked window. His toolbox sat on the passenger seat, latched shut, going wherever he was going. The radio moved through its frequencies the way desert radio does, fading and returning. And in the middle of a long, quiet stretch between two places he was not hurrying toward, the broadcast reached him a segment from the post-race coverage, a commentator's voice still bright with the surprise of what had happened, describing the Titan Apex comeback, the championship implications, the performance of a car that had seemed, just hours before the flag fell, to be finished for the season. Walter listened to it for a moment without changing the channel. A small thing moved across his face, not quite a smile, or maybe exactly a smile, but one of the quiet ones, that belong entirely to the person making them and ask nothing of anyone watching. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. He drove on into the gold of the early morning, and the road ahead was long and empty and honest, and the engine beneath him ran smooth and clean, the way engines do when someone has taken the time to properly understand them. Experience doesn't live in credentials. It lives in the hands of the people who kept showing up long after the world stopped calling their name, who kept paying attention, who never stopped trying to understand the thing in front of them, even when the world had decided their understanding wasn't worth the trouble of asking about. The man who was overlooked in every room knew more than everyone in it. Technology will always outpace the people who invented it, until the night it needs a human being who remembers how to listen.